Have you ever boarded a flight, and within the first few minutes someone looked at you and said, "Sorry, this seat isn't for you." It's not because you did anything wrong. It's not because you caused trouble. It's simply because they think you don't belong there. That's exactly what happened to a black woman quietly seated in seat 1A. She was asked to leave her paid-for seat, pushed to the back row, amidst curious, indifferent stares and a familiar silence. But there's one thing nobody on that flight knew. That woman is the owner of this entire airline. And she faced a very human choice. Reveal her identity to end it all immediately, or remain silent, accept the hurt, and see clearly how the system treats those who have no voice. If it were you, what would you choose? Will you stand up for yourself, or will you remain silent and let the truth come to light? If you've ever been looked down upon, judged simply because of your appearance, status, or skin color, then this story isn't just hers, it's yours too. Stay and listen until the end. And if you feel this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to join us on this journey. The North Star Airways, Boeing 787, stood silently at Gate C-17 of Los Angeles International Airport. Outside, the bright California sun streamed across the runway, reflecting a cool light onto the silver fuselage. Inside the first-class cabin, the atmosphere was quite different. Everything was kept at just the right temperature. The lighting was soft. The scent of new leather seats mingled with the faint aroma of roasted coffee. It looked like a perfect morning according to the standards of those accustomed to flying at the front of the plane. Evelyn Brooks is seated in seat 2A. She had fastened her seatbelt. Her handbag rested neatly at her feet. Her hands rested lightly on her thighs. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't wearing headphones. She was simply silently observing the cabin gradually filling up. She wore a simple ash-gray sweater, dark pants, flat shoes, no logos, no eye-catching accessories. Her black hair was neatly tied back. Her face was calm, as if this were just another ordinary flight among many she had taken. In fact, for Evelyn Brooks, flying from Los Angeles to New York was nothing new. Footsteps echoed from the central aisle, even steady, carrying the familiar rhythm of someone who had walked through this airplane corridor thousands of times. Captain Thomas Whitaker appears. He was impeccably dressed in his pilot's uniform. The 4 stripes on his epaulets gleamed in the lights. His gray hair was neatly combed, not a single strand out of place. He walked with an upright posture, shoulders back, his gaze sweeping quickly across the first-class cabin like someone inspecting their territory. He stopped at the first row of seats. He nodded to a familiar passenger. They exchanged a few pleasantries. Then his gaze swept across the room. When Captain Whitaker's gaze settled on seat 2A, there was a very brief pause, not long enough to be called staring, but long enough to sense that something wasn't quite right in his thoughts. He looked Evelyn up and down. His gaze lingered on her flat shoes, then her simple sweater, then her calm, unperturbed, dark face. A very faint wrinkle appeared between his eyebrows. Captain Whitaker took another step closer. "Ma'am?" His voice rang out clear and decisive, not harsh, not loud, but loud enough for those sitting around him to hear. Evelyn lifted her head. "Yes, excuse me, but I think there's some misunderstanding here," he said, his eyes glancing quickly toward the aisle. "This seat isn't for you." The first-class cabin, which usually only had the faint sound of the air conditioner, suddenly became much quieter. A few passengers looked up. Some tilted their heads slightly. Some paused to put down their coffee cups. A subtle attention, but enough for Evelyn to sense it. She didn't change her posture. She didn't frown. She didn't react strongly. "Seat 2A," she said slowly. "I'm reserving this seat." Captain Whitaker tilted his head slightly as if trying to be polite, but there was a cold, hard tone in his voice. "Madam," he said, "the first-class cabin of the North Star has certain standards, and I believe your seat is at the back." A silence fell between them. Evelyn looked straight at him. Her gaze was neither challenging nor pleading, just a clear, alert look as if she were more accustomed to this kind of situation than anyone else present. "Captain," she said, her voice even and low, "I have a ticket. I boarded the right flight, and I'm in the right seat." A female passenger in the row opposite coughed softly. The man in front shifted slightly in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Captain Whitaker clenched his jaw slightly. "Could you show me your boarding pass?" Evelyn reached into her bag. She took out her boarding pass. She held it up unhurriedly. He took it, looked. 1 second. 2 seconds. The name is clearly displayed. Brooks Evelyn, Seat 2A, Class First. Captain Whitaker said nothing immediately. He looked back at Evelyn. Then he looked at the card one more time. Are you traveling alone, he asked. Yes. No assistant. No one to accompany me. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. Does that have anything to do with anything? A few glances exchanged within the cabin. No one spoke, but the atmosphere had changed. The initial elegant tranquility now carried a thin layer of tension. Captain Whitaker lowered his voice. Ma'am, I just want to make sure there's no confusion that might affect other passengers. Evelyn took a slow breath. She recognized a familiar feeling rising within her. Not anger, not fear, but a very old, very deep weariness, the weariness of someone who had too many times had to prove that she had the right to stand where she stood. Captain, she said softly but firmly, I'm not harming anyone. Captain Whitaker stood straighter. We'll get to the bottom of this, he said. Please stand up for a moment. The word please is well placed, but the meaning behind it isn't so gentle. Evelyn didn't get up right away. She looked around the first-class cabin. Familiar faces of the well-served class, curious glances, avoidant glances, and also glances of relief knowing that this wouldn't happen to them. She suddenly thought of a very early morning just a few hours earlier when she had signed a thick stack of papers in a quiet conference room in Manhattan. I remember what the lawyer said back then. After this signature, everything will be different. Evelyn turned to look at Captain Whitaker. Okay, she said, but I want everything to be clear. Captain Whitaker nodded as if he were in complete control of the situation. We will handle it quickly. Evelyn placed both hands on the armrests of the chair. She stood up. The moment she left seat 2, no one in first class said a word, but everyone was watching her. And none of them knew that at that very moment, the future of North Star Airways no longer rested in the hands of the man wearing the 4 stripes on his shoulder. Evelyn Brooks stood in the aisle between first-class seats, her hand still resting lightly on the armrest of seat 2A. She wasn't in a hurry to leave, nor did she look at Captain Thomas Whitaker. She simply stood there perfectly straight, perfectly calm, as if this wasn't a moment of being asked to leave her seat, but merely a brief stop on a much longer journey. There are situations in life that don't require a quick reaction. Evelyn learned that from a very young age. She heard the clicking of a seatbelt as someone adjusted their position, a small clearing of the throat, a suppressed sigh. It was all very quiet, but to Evelyn every sound was clear. Not because she was nervous, but because she was used to reading the atmosphere of rooms. She used to stand in boardrooms where all eyes were on her, waiting to see if she had the capability to run a multi-billion-dollar deal. She used to sit at dinner tables where the first question wasn't, "What do you do?" but "Who are you with?" And many times she learned to be silent not because she was weak, but because she knew that silence when right carries its own weight. Captain Whitaker gestured to a nearby flight attendant. The young woman whose name tag read Lena Morales flinched slightly at being called. She stepped forward, her eyes quickly, scanning Evelyn, then returning to the captain, clearly trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Lena," Captain said softly but clearly. "Check the manifest again, seat 2A. Lena nodded. She held the scanner, but her movements were slower than usual. She glanced quickly at Evelyn, her eyes showing a hint of hesitation. Evelyn noticed it. She was familiar with such looks. Not contemptuous, but the look of someone caught between two opposing sides, unsure of what to believe. Evelyn smiled very gently at Lena. Not a polite smile, but a reassuring smile. "It's all right," Evelyn said softly. "Just do your work." Lena nodded slightly, but when she bent down to look at the screen, her eyebrows furrowed slightly. Captain Whitaker crossed his arms over his chest. It was the familiar posture of someone who believed they were in control. He looked around the cabin as if sending a silent message things were being handled. Evelyn slowly stepped away from the seating area. She stood to one side, making way for others if needed. No one needed to. No one moved. Everyone just watched. For a brief moment, Evelyn felt an old wave surge through her chest. Not anger, not shame, but memories. She recalled her first time walking into a technology conference in San Francisco more than 15 years ago. She was the only black woman in the room. An investor asked her in front of everyone, "Who did you come with?" She smiled and replied, "I came with my business plan." The room fell silent, much like this airplane cabin now. Moments like these don't disappear. They just subside, waiting for another occasion to remind us who we are. "Miss Brooks," Lena's voice brought Evelyn back to the present. Lena held the scanner in her hand, looked at Captain, then at Evelyn. Your name is correct on the manifest. Seat 2A. First class. There was a brief silence, but it was enough for Captain Whitaker to realize that it didn't match his expectations. He tilted his head. Are you sure? Lena nodded. Yes, Captain. Captain Whitaker said nothing immediately. He looked at Evelyn. His gaze was different now. No longer the absolute certainty he had initially held, but something mixed with suspicion and unease. Miss Brooks, he said, I need to ask you a few more questions. Evelyn nodded. Go ahead and ask. Do you fly with North Star often? Quite often. And what field do you work in? The question was asked naturally. But Evelyn heard something familiar behind it. A question not aimed at understanding, but at categorization. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at Captain Whitaker, then at Lena, then at the passengers who were pretending not to hear but were actually listening intently. I'm in business, Evelyn said. Specifically business, she repeated, her voice still even. Captain Whitaker pursed his lips. Ma'am, we just want to make sure everything on this flight goes smoothly. Evelyn nodded slightly. Me too. A male passenger in the seat in front shook his head slightly, as if wanting to say something but then refrained. The woman by the window tightened her grip on her handbag. The atmosphere began to grow heavy, though no one raised their voice. Captain Whitaker lowered his voice. Perhaps to avoid any misunderstanding, you should move to the rear compartment. We'll arrange compensation later. Evelyn felt her hands grow cold, not because the offer was unexpected, but because she knew very well what would happen if she agreed, and what would happen if she didn't. In that moment, she clearly saw two paths. One was short, easy, and ended quickly. The other was longer, more difficult, but more necessary. She thought of the people who had sat in those seats behind her, those who had no choice. She thought of the times she had wondered if anyone would listen if she spoke up. Evelyn lifted her head. Captain, she said slowly, loud enough for everyone to hear. I don't object to you following proper procedures, but I don't agree to leaving my seat when I haven't done anything wrong. Captain Whitaker clenched his jaw. Madam, I am the person in charge of this flight. I understand, Evelyn replied, and I take responsibility for what I say. Another silence, this time longer. Lena stood between the two, feeling the invisible pressure. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Finally, she looked at Captain. Captain, Lena said, her voice low but firm. The manifest is flawless. Captain Whitaker turned to her, his gaze sharpened. You may return to your position. Lena nodded. But before leaving, she looked at Evelyn one more time. This time, her gaze was no longer hesitant. Evelyn watched Lena, then turned back to Captain. He can clarify everything Evelyn said, or he can make it into something else. Captain Whitaker gave a wry smile. Are you threatening me? No, Evelyn shook her head. I'm giving you a choice. Captain Whitaker stood upright. He looked at his watch. Then he looked around the cabin. We'll continue this after takeoff, he said. In the meantime, please cooperate. Evelyn said nothing more. She followed the direction Captain pointed. No hurry, no bowing. She walked down the aisle under watchful eyes and began toward the rear of the plane. As she stepped through the curtain separating first class from the next compartment, she heard a very faint sigh behind her. She didn't know whose it was. She didn't come back. She knew that there are moments in life when you don't need to prove who you are. You just need enough patience to let others reveal themselves. And Flight NS 417 has only just begun. Captain Thomas Whitaker stepped back into the cockpit, pulling the door shut behind him. A dry click sound separated him from the passenger compartment. The space was different, less light, smaller, but for Whitaker this was where he felt he belonged. He took off his hat and placed it on the rack. He pulled out a handkerchief and gently wiped his forehead even though the air conditioner was running steadily. Not because of the heat, but because a vague, unpleasant feeling still lingered. It's nothing, he muttered as if talking to himself. The first officer, a much younger man sitting beside him, turned his head to look. He said nothing, just glanced quickly before returning to the control panel. Whitaker disliked that look. It made him feel as though someone was judging him without a word. He leaned back in his chair. He took a deep breath. Then he exhaled slowly. In over 30 years of flying, Thomas Whitaker had handled every kind of situation. Bad weather, technical malfunctions, drunk passengers, troublemakers, none of that fazed him. Everything had a procedure, and he understood that procedure better than anyone. What bothered him were things that didn't fit within familiar boundaries. like the woman sitting in seat 2A just now. He remembered the moment he first saw her very clearly. The way she sat, the way she looked straight at him. No lowering of her head, no rushing to explain, no trying to please anyone. Whitaker didn't like that. In his mind, first class always had a very clear image. People in suits. People talking on the phone about contracts, stocks. Familiar faces, names he had heard before. Not because he cared about them, but because they fit his image of order. That woman didn't fit that image. Whitaker told himself he was just doing his job, that he just wanted to avoid trouble. But deeper down, he knew something else was being touched. An old belief built up over the years that he had the ability to look at a person and know where they belonged. He had believed in that possibility for a very long time, too long to give up easily. "We're about to close the cabin," the first officer said in a neutral tone. Whitaker nodded. "Send the message." When his voice boomed through the loudspeaker, he heard himself again. A deep, firm voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thomas Whitaker. We are preparing for takeoff." He paused for a very brief moment, then continued. No one noticed, but he did. After the announcement, Whitaker sat still, staring at the control panel. The indicators were all fine. The weather was favorable. A smooth flight if only there weren't any unexpected problems. He recalled that morning before heading to the airport, the usual breakfast, black coffee, financial news playing on the screen. A short report on the airline industry about how airlines had to adapt to the new times. Whitaker had shaken his head when he heard that. A new era, he once thought. Airplanes still need pilots, and pilots need discipline. For Whitaker, discipline is more than just following procedures. It's about order. It's about knowing who's above and who's below. It's about not letting things get out of control. The cockpit door opened. A flight attendant stepped in. It wasn't Lena. It was Jason Reed. A faint smile played on his face. Captain Jason whispered, "The passengers are settled. But the woman we were talking to is in the back. She doesn't look very happy." Whitaker glanced at Jason. "Is she causing trouble?" "Not yet," Jason shrugged. "But I don't think she's familiar with the place." Whitaker smirked. "Nobody gets used to everything right away." Jason chuckled softly. "Yes, Captain." Whitaker nodded. "If there are any problems, let me know. I don't want this flight to be affected." Jason turned away. As the door closed, Whitaker leaned back in his chair once more. He felt a satisfaction that was difficult to name. Not joy, rather a familiar feeling as everything returned to its proper place as he believed it to be. In the back compartment, Evelyn Brooks was settling into her new seat. Whitaker couldn't see it, but in his mind, he pictured it vividly. She would be annoyed, she would be irritated, but then she would be silent, like everyone else. He had seen that too many times. Whitaker didn't consider himself a bad person. He believed he was fair, that he treated everyone equally. But equally in his thinking meant that each person was in their proper place. People like him built their careers on that belief, and it gave him everything. A stable job, a high salary, respect, nods of approval every time he walked by. He saw no reason to change. The co-pilot glanced over. "Captain, are you all right?" Whitaker turned back. "Okay. Just a passenger who didn't understand the rules." The co-pilot nodded. But there was still a hint of unease in his eyes. Whitaker looked ahead. The runway stretched out. The signal lights flashed. Everything was ready. "We're taking off," he said. The plane began to taxi. Thrust gradually increased. Whitaker focused on the maneuvers. This was his best part. Where everything followed the laws of physics, there was no emotion, no argument. As the plane's wheels lifted off the ground, Whitaker felt a familiar sensation wash over him. A sense of control. The feeling that he was taking hundreds of people into the sky, relying on his skill and decisions. In the passenger compartment, many people breathed a sigh of relief. Some closed their eyes. Others continued reading their newspapers. Life went on, at least on the surface. Whitaker switched on autopilot after reaching a stable altitude. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He stretched slightly. "This flight will be peaceful," he said, as if making a statement. But somewhere deep inside, another feeling began to form. A vague feeling that there was something he hadn't seen, something he hadn't fully understood. Whitaker brushed it aside. He had long since learned to dismiss such feelings. He didn't realize that while he believed he had just restored order, he was actually taking another step toward the collapse of that order. Flight NS 417 continued its eastward descent, carrying hundreds of people, each with their own story. And somewhere in the rear cabin, a woman was quietly observing, remembering, and waiting, not for revenge, but to allow the truth enough space to reveal itself. The plane had reached a stable altitude. The seatbelt sign was turned off. A gentle wave of movement spread throughout the cabin as passengers began adjusting their seats, taking out books, opening laptops, and ordering drinks. In first class, the atmosphere seemed to have returned to its familiar rhythm: whispered conversations. The gentle clinking of glasses, the scent of white wine mingled with the fragrance of expensive perfume. Margaret Collins sat in seat 1C right next to the aisle. She was in her 50s, her blonde hair, perfectly styled and voluminous, a silk scarf loosely tied around her neck. She had flown with North Star for over 20 years. Her name was on the priority list. Her face was familiar to most of the veteran flight attendants. Margaret leaned forward and called softly, "Excuse me." Lena Morales stopped. She bowed and smiled in a manner befitting a professional. "Excuse me, ma'am. How can I help you?" Margaret glanced toward the front of the compartment where seat 2A was now empty. Her eyes held a cleverly concealed dissatisfaction. "What happened just now?" she said, her voice low but sharp. "What was that about?" Lena paused briefly. She chose her words carefully. "It was just a small misunderstanding, ma'am." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "A mistake," she chuckled softly. "I didn't think North Star's first-class cabin would ever have such a mix-up." Lena felt her throat dry up. "We've taken care of it." Margaret nodded but didn't stop there. "I hope so," she said, "because I chose North Star not just for the comfort, but for the selectivity." The word selective was uttered softly, but Lena understood the meaning behind it. "Yes, ma'am," Lena replied. Margaret leaned back. "I don't want inappropriate situations to spoil my experience." Lena nodded, then walked away quietly. As she turned, she felt a heavy weight on her shoulders. Not because Margaret had raised her voice, but because of the frighteningly natural way in which she took her privilege for granted. In the back seat, Evelyn Brooks was sitting in the row near the back. The seat was next to the aisle. The space was narrower. The light was harsher. The noise was more noticeable. She fastened her seatbelt. She neatly placed her handbag under the seat in front of her. She was surrounded by strangers. A middle-aged man was typing incessantly on his laptop. A young woman was cradling her sleeping child. An elderly couple was speaking very softly. Evelyn inhaled slowly. She wasn't angry at Margaret Collins, not at Captain Whitaker. She'd been through too many similar situations to be angry. What bothered her was something deeper, how the systems were built to normalize such behavior. She recalled a meeting many years ago when a partner told her, "You don't look like a CEO." When she asked why, he laughed and said, "I mean, you're more approachable." Being approachable in that world often meant having less power. Another flight attendant appeared, Jason Reed. He pushed the service cart and stopped at Evelyn's seat. "Drinks?" Jason asked without looking directly at her. "Give me a glass of water," Evelyn replied. Jason set his glass down without smiling. "We're running out of options. Only the basics are left." "It's all right," Evelyn said. Jason nodded and pushed the cart away. As he turned his back, he shrugged slightly as if it were nothing worth bothering about. Evelyn watched him. She didn't blame Jason. She knew where that kind of behavior came from. It was nurtured by those at the top, by the indifferent stares, by the times when no one was called upon. In the front row, Margaret Collins took a sip of wine. She leaned over to the man sitting next to her and spoke softly. "Did you see what just happened?" she asked. The man shrugged. "I just saw them handling it pretty quickly." "That's right," Margaret said. "At least they know how to correct their mistakes." The man chuckled softly. "That's why we're paying." Margaret nodded, satisfied. In the cockpit, Captain Whitaker was reviewing some parameters. Jason knocked and entered. Captain Jason said, "First class is fine, but Mrs. Collins mentioned what happened earlier." Whitaker didn't look up. What did she say? She just wanted to make sure that there wouldn't be any more similar situations. Whitaker nodded. "We've got it done. Miss Brooks has moved." Jason hesitated. "Yes, but what if she complains?" Whitaker turned around, his eyes cold. "About what?" Jason remained silent. Whitaker continued, his voice firm. "Jason, our job is to keep this flight safe, Not to please individuals. There are decisions that must be made. Jason nodded. I understand. Whitaker leaned back in his seat. If there's any problem from the rear compartment, report it to me immediately. Jason turned away. Whitaker watched the door close. He felt a sense of certainty return. The certainty of someone who believes they have just done what needed to be done, but somewhere deep inside the airplane cabin, that tranquility was only superficial. Evelyn Brooks looked out the window. Outside the sky was a deep blue, the clouds stretching as far as the eye could see. She thought of Daniel Price, of the text message she had sent before the plane took off, of the brief reply she had received. I'm watching. Just let things unfold as they are. Evelyn didn't know how far things would go, nor was she sure how far she wanted them to go. A part of her wanted to stand up, clear things up, and end this immediately. But then she thought of Lena, of the hesitant yet sincere look in the young flight attendant's eyes, of people like Jason, like Captain Whitaker, who believed they were doing the right thing because they were never forced to look back. If she had spoken up immediately, everything would have ended quickly. An apology, a few handshakes, an internal memo. And then everything would have gone back to how it was. Evelyn didn't want that. She wanted to see this system operate without anyone knowing who she was. She wanted to know how far it would go, who it would protect, and who it would sacrifice. The plane shook slightly as it entered a small area of turbulence. An announcement blared, reminding passengers to fasten their seatbelts. Some sighed, some closed their eyes. Margaret Collins adjusted her silk scarf, looking displeased. This seems a bit bumpy, she said to Lena as she returned to the cabin. It's just a slight disturbance, Lena replied. Margaret nodded. I hope so. I don't like surprises. Lena smiled reflexively, but inwardly a question arose. Since when had the presence of another person been considered an unwelcome surprise? In the back compartment, Evelyn Brooks fastened her seatbelt. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen to herself. She knew that from this moment on, every choice she made would not only affect her alone, they would touch other people, other stories, other flights. And ahead, Captain Thomas Whitaker still believed that everything was under his control. Flight NS 417 continued its journey, carrying not only passengers but also beliefs that collided silently at an altitude of 35,000 feet. The smooth, rolling sound of the trolley wheels echoed along the narrow aisle at the back of the cabin. The plastic cups clinked softly against each other, creating a steady rhythm, a reminder that the flight was drifting along at its familiar inertia. Evelyn Brooks sat up straight. The back of the chair in front of her didn't recline much. There was just enough room for her knees. She placed the thin notebook on her lap, but didn't open it. She listened not to find excuses, but to understand. A voice slightly high-pitched and somewhat irritated came from the seat in front. Excuse me, I pressed the call button a while ago. Jason Reed paused. He bent down his face, showing signs of fatigue. We're busy, ma'am. But I need hot water for the baby, the woman said, trying to keep her voice calm. Jason sighed, turning his head to look at the trolley. I'll be back later. Evelyn looked at the scene, then at her hands. Hands that had once signed contracts hundreds of pages long. Hands that had shaken hands with the most powerful people in the industry. Those hands now rested still on her lap, not trembling, not shaking. She knew that feeling of helplessness. Not just that woman's, but the feeling of an entire cabin where their needs always came second. Up front, the first-class cabin was operating smoothly. Glasses were set down gently. Wine was poured carefully. Voices were soft and polite. Margaret Collins leaned over and called Lena's name again. Lena, I need to ask you one more thing, she said, her voice sweet but sharp. Lena paused. Yes, ma'am. That woman just now, Margaret said, her gaze directed behind her. She seemed displeased. Lena maintained her smile. We've arranged the seating appropriately, ma'am. Appropriate, Margaret raised an eyebrow. I just hope North Star understands that customers like us expect a certain standard. Lena nodded. We understand. Margaret leaned back and took a sip of wine. Good, because I don't want things like this to become a precedent. The word precedent was uttered softly, but Lena could clearly hear its weight. She turned away, her heart beating a little faster. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Whitaker was reviewing the flight map. Everything was stable, no warnings, no reason to worry. Jason knocked on the door and entered. Captain, what's wrong? Whitaker asked, his eyes still glued to the screen. There were a few minor complaints in the back, Jason said. Nothing serious. But Miss Brooks didn't seem happy. Whitaker turned around, his eyes cold. What is she doing? No. Just be quiet. Whitaker nodded. Silence is good. We don't need any more drama. Jason hesitated for a second. Mrs. Collins brought this up again. She wants to make sure the experience isn't affected. Whitaker pursed his lips. Mrs. Collins always has an opinion. Yes, Jason replied. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. Jason, I've made my decision. Miss Brooks has moved. That's the end of it. Jason nodded. But as he turned to leave, Whitaker called him back. If she causes trouble, Whitaker said, I want to know right away. Jason paused. Yes, Captain. The door closed. Whitaker looked ahead, feeling the familiarity of authority. A command, a consequence, and the silence that followed often interpreted as consent. He didn't see Lena's eyes as she stood in the front aisle clutching her serving napkin. She'd heard enough. And in her heart a question kept repeating itself. If everything is following the rules, why does it feel so wrong? In the back compartment, Evelyn Brooks opened her notebook. She didn't write right away. She just turned a blank page. Then another. Finally, she put pen to paper. She didn't record the event as someone who had been offended. She recorded it as someone observing the system in operation. Time, behavior, reaction, words, attitude. She documented how Jason avoided eye contact with passengers, how apologies were neglected, how basic needs were postponed, and how everything was justified by the word busy. A slight turbulence caused the plane to shake. A clicking sound echoed throughout the cabin. Several passengers gripped the armrests. Evelyn instinctively looked up. She had sat in the cockpits of small planes before learned to read the movement of the air. She could feel the slight tension in the fuselage. Not dangerous, but enough to test your composure. The loudspeaker boomed. Captain Whitaker's voice, deep and firm, said, Ladies and gentlemen, we are passing through an area of mild turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. That voice, familiar and authoritative, reassured many. But for Evelyn it carried a different meaning. It reminded her that on this flight there were people who believed their voice was the law. She thought back to that moment in first class, to his first words, to Captain America's gaze, to how he didn't ask her who she was, but whether she belonged here. Another flight attendant walked by and stopped. It was Lena. Are you all right? Lena asked softly. Evelyn looked up. She met Lena's eyes. I'm fine. How about you, Lena? Was slightly surprised. She forced a smile. I just wanted to make sure everyone was okay. Evelyn nodded. Thank you. The two women stared at each other for a second longer than usual. In that moment, Lena saw in Evelyn not anger, but a clarity that bewildered her. Is there anything else you need? Lena asked. One more glass of water will do, Evelyn replied. Lena turned away, but something within her changed. She began to wonder what she would do if she were in that position. In first class, Margaret Collins adjusted her pillow. She felt satisfied, not because the issue was resolved, but because it had been resolved the way she expected. Quick, clean, without disturbance. North Star is still North Star, she said to the man beside her. They know how to keep the order. The man nodded. That's why we're loyal. In the cockpit, Whitaker checked his watch. Everything was on schedule. No incidents. No new reports. He told himself he had done the right thing, that a small decision to keep the majority calm was necessary, that without firmness things would spiral out of control. He didn't know that this small decision was being recorded in detail by the woman he believed had been marginalized. Evelyn Brooks closed her notebook. She leaned her head back in her chair. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to prepare. She knew that from the moment Captain Whitaker chose this course of action, he hadn't just pushed her aside. He has pushed himself forward into a chain of consequences from which he sees no end. And Flight NS 417, still quietly heading towards New York, carried with it a seemingly invisible decision, yet one powerful enough to shake an entire system. Evelyn Brooks's seat was in the near last row of the cabin. Not absolutely the last, but close enough to clearly sense the distinct atmosphere. Here, the smell of new leather and perfume faded, giving way to the scent of plastic, stale coffee, and a very difficult-to-describe smell, the smell of accumulated haste and fatigue. The seat didn't recline very far. When Evelyn tried adjusting it, the backrest only moved back a little, just enough for her back to lightly touch the firm cushion. No one complained. No one was surprised. Here, those limitations were considered normal. Evelyn placed her feet parallel, subtly shifting her bag so it wouldn't obstruct the aisle. She noticed the space between the rows of seats was noticeably narrower than in front of her. The man's knees almost touched the seat in front of him. He sighed softly, as if accustomed to having to slouch on a flight. A child in the seat across the hall was whimpering softly. The mother leaned down, soothing the child in a whisper. There was no immediate call from the flight attendant. The mother was patient, as if she had learned that in this cabin patience was a survival skill. Evelyn watched the scene, her heart tightening slightly. She used to sit in seats like these. Years ago, when her company was very small, when every flight was a carefully considered expense, she remembers the feeling then, not discomfort from the cramped space, but the feeling of having to shrink back, not cause trouble, not demand anything. That feeling returned more distinctly than she had imagined. Jason Reed walked past, pushing a service cart. The wheels squeaked because the floor wasn't smooth. He stopped at the seat in front of Evelyn, handed her a glass of water, and continued on his way. When he reached Evelyn, he didn't stop immediately. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said calmly. "I haven't received my drink yet." Jason stopped the car and turned around. His eyes quickly glanced at her. "We're serving an order." "Yes," Evelyn replied. "I understand." Jason looked at her for another second as if considering something. Then he took a plastic cup, poured water from the pitcher, and placed it on the tray in front of her. No smile. No apology. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Jason nodded and pushed the cart forward. No one paid attention to that brief exchange. But to Evelyn it said a lot. Not about Jason, but about what he was allowed to express. At the front of the cabin, Lena Morales stood in the galley holding the service list. She glanced back where Evelyn was seated. From that distance, Evelyn looked tiny. Not because she was small, but because the space here made everyone appear that way. Lena felt a heavy sensation in her chest. She didn't know why. She just knew something wasn't right. She recalled her first training session when the instructor said, "Every passenger is equally important." At the time, Lena believed him. But then reality gradually taught her that there are passengers who are more important, and now she is seeing that boundary with her own eyes. The plane vibrated slightly as it entered an area of turbulent air. There was a metallic clicking sound somewhere above. The seatbelt sign lit up. Evelyn looked around. Several people gripped the handrails. The man beside her closed his eyes, breathing deeply. The child cried again, this time louder. The mother holding her baby stood up instinctively, then sat back down when she realized the warning light had come on. No flight attendants appeared immediately. Evelyn could feel the plane's movements very clearly. She had learned to fly small planes and had sat in the cockpit during bad weather. She knew this feeling wasn't dangerous, but she also knew that for many people here, it was far more frightening. She looked at the man beside her. "Are you all right?" she asked. He opened his eyes, slightly surprised. "Oh, yes. It's just that I don't like being jolted around." "We'll be all right," Evelyn said softly. He nodded, appearing calmer. In first class, Margaret Collins winced as the plane shook. She pressed the call button. Lena appeared immediately. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked. "It's just a slight disturbance," Lena replied. Margaret sighed. "I don't like this feeling. We'll be out of here soon," Lena said. Margaret nodded, but her eyes still showed dissatisfaction. "Last time I flew with North Star, the flight was very smooth." Lena smiled. "We always try our best." In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Whitaker gripped the controls tightly. He adjusted a few parameters, deciding not to change altitude immediately. He wanted to ride through this turbulent area as he always did. "We should change altitude," First Officer said cautiously. Whitaker shook his head. "No need. It's just a little bumpy. We'll get through it quickly." The First Officer remained silent. He didn't argue, but he felt a little uneasy. Not because of the danger, but because of the attitude. In the last compartment, a suitcase in the overhead luggage compartment vibrated slightly, making a noise. A passenger looked up, their eyes filled with anxiety. Evelyn watched. She placed her hand on the armrest of the chair. She took a deep breath. She wasn't afraid. But she couldn't help thinking about how the decisions made in front directly affected those behind, those who had no voice. Another flight attendant finally appeared, hurrying along, checking to make sure everyone had their seatbelts fastened. As she passed Evelyn, she paused for a second. "Are you all right?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. I'm fine. The flight attendant smiled slightly, then continued on her way. It was the first time since she had sat down there that someone had asked her that question. The plane gradually stabilized. The warning lights were still on, but the turbulence had subsided. A wave of relief swept through the cabin. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. Not to rest, but to sort out her thoughts. She thought about the distance between the two compartments, not just a few meters, but about how people were treated, how attention was distributed, how power, however invisible, flowed in a very clear direction. She thought of Lena, of the young flight attendant's questioning gaze, of Jason, who had learned to be cold as a defense mechanism, of Captain Whitaker, who believed he was maintaining order, and she thought about herself, about her choice to remain silent, about accepting to sit here a little longer, not because she couldn't change the situation, but because she wanted to see the whole picture. Evelyn opened her eyes. She looked out the window. White clouds drifted slowly below, as if the outside world were completely unaware of what was happening inside this airplane. She took out her notebook again. She added a few more lines. Not about the shaking, but about how people react when faced with a challenge. She knew that the back seat on the plane wasn't just a position. It was a test. And not everyone on this flight was going to pass that test. Flight NS 417 continued its eastward journey, and in the rear cabin, Evelyn Brooks sat there quietly, patiently waiting for the right moment. The cabin gradually stabilized. The shaking subsided and then disappeared. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated, but the tension of a few minutes earlier was gone. In the back row, Evelyn Brooks sat upright, her hands resting on a thin notebook on her lap. She didn't open it immediately. She waited. Sometimes waiting isn't procrastination. It's about letting things fall into place naturally. Around her, the quiet rhythm of life continued. The man beside her took out his headphones and put on some soft music. The child in the seat opposite finally fell asleep on her mother's shoulder. A flight attendant walked by, checked the seatbelts, and nodded to a few passengers. No one paid attention to Evelyn, and that's what made her most dangerous. She gently opened her handbag. Inside, there was no bulky laptop, no thick stack of documents. Just a black phone without a case or logo. She picked it up and unlocked it. The screen lit up. No new notifications. She took a slow breath, then opened the messaging app secured by a private code. The name that appeared at the top of the conversation was Daniel Price. Daniel is more than just a lawyer. He's the acting COO of an investment firm that Evelyn has built over the past 10 years. A man accustomed to handling big deals quietly and accustomed to not asking unnecessary questions. Evelyn types very slowly. We need to adjust the plan. She paused, looked at the text that had just appeared. Then she continued. Don't interfere. It's not the right time yet. The 3 dots appeared almost immediately. Are you all right? Daniel replied. Evelyn stared at the question for a few seconds. She didn't answer immediately. Not because she wasn't okay, but because the answer needed to be precise. I'm fine, she typed. But I want to see the whole picture. There was a silence for a few seconds. Then Daniel texted back. Are you sure? Evelyn closed her eyes for a very brief moment. The image of first class, Captain Whitaker's gaze, Margaret Collins's voice, the way Jason avoided eye contact with passengers, Lena's hesitant look. I'm sure, she replied. Just let things happen. Daniel didn't ask any further questions. He just sent a short message. I'm watching. When she says stop, everything will stop. Evelyn turned off the screen. She put the phone back in her pocket. The movement was subtle, not attracting attention. No one in the cabin knew that in that moment a decision more important than any other on this flight had just been made. Not by the person in the cockpit, but by the person sitting in the row near the back. In first class, Margaret Collins was watching a documentary on the screen in front of her. She adjusted her headphones occasionally, frowning at the lingering turbulence. For her, the flight was going as expected. There had been a minor hiccup, but it had been resolved. She didn't know that this treatment was being recorded in a very different way. Lena Morales walked slowly down the aisle, holding the service list. She stopped at the galley, glancing back at the compartment once more. Evelyn Brooks was still seated back straight, her gaze fixed on the window. There was something about that woman that Lena couldn't take her eyes off. Not because of her appearance, but because of her calmness that seemed out of place in the situation. Lena recalled Evelyn's gaze during their brief conversation. No resentment, no demands, just a very steady presence. Lena wondered if she could remain calm, if she were treated that way. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Whitaker was reviewing the landing schedule. Everything was on time. No changes. He was satisfied. First officer glanced at him. "Captain, that disturbance just now. Perhaps we should give a more detailed report." Whitaker shrugged. "No need. It's insignificant." First officer remained silent. He looked at the control panel, then looked straight ahead. Something was bothering him, but he didn't say anything. Whitaker leaned back in his seat. He felt the flight was heading in the right direction. The initial problems had been resolved. Everyone was settled. He didn't know that this sense of security was only superficial. In the back compartment, Evelyn Brooks opened her notebook again. This time, she wasn't just taking notes. She was drawing a very simple diagram, not an organizational chart, but a flow of behavior. Who said what to whom? How did everyone react? Who remained silent? Who intervened? Who avoided the issue? She circled a few names: Captain Thomas Whitaker, Margaret Collins, Jason Reed, and another name lightly underlined, Lena Morales. Evelyn paused there for a little longer. Not because Lena was perfect, but because she had a choice. Evelyn thought back to the early years of her career, when she too had stood on that very line. Between following the crowd and speaking up, between playing it safe and being right, no one is born strong. People learn to be strong when they have no other choice. A flight attendant walked by. This time it was Jason. He stopped and checked the tray table. "Do you need me to clear the trays?" he asked, his voice even. Evelyn shook her head. "Not yet." Jason nodded and continued walking. Nothing else happened. No conflict. No drama. Everything was perfectly normal. And it is precisely that normalcy that is the scariest thing. The plane continued flying through long stretches of white clouds. Time passed slowly. For many, it was just another flight in their lives. For Evelyn, it was a test the system was conducting on itself. She wondered if she weren't herself, if she were just an ordinary passenger. How would this story end? Would Captain Whitaker have been reprimanded? Would Jason have changed his service? Would Margaret Collins ever reconsider the word precedent? Probably not. And that's why she chose to remain silent a little longer. In first class, Margaret took off her headphones and called Lena. "How much longer until we reach New York?" she asked. "About 4 hours, ma'am," Lena replied. Margaret nodded. "Good. I have a meeting as soon as I land." Lena smiled and turned away. A thought flashed through her mind. There are people who always have plans for what happens after landing, and there are people who just want the flight to end peacefully. In the cockpit, Whitaker checked the gauges again. He felt a firm sense of confidence. No reports, no malfunctions, nothing to worry about. He didn't know that in the back row someone was waiting for that exact moment. Not meant to cause a fuss. So that when the truth comes out, no one can say they didn't see it. Flight NS 417 continued its journey soaring across the vast sky. And within it, a story was gradually moving into its next chapter, where seemingly insignificant decisions would begin to leave indelible marks. There's an unwritten rule in long-established power systems. When those in power begin to feel challenged, they don't usually back down. They go further. Captain Thomas Whitaker didn't realize that moment was coming his way. Or perhaps he did realize it but chose to ignore it. The cockpit was quiet. The soft light from the control panels reflected off his face, highlighting the wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. Whitaker had been flying for nearly half his life. He was used to the pressure, used to making decisions in seconds, and used to not being questioned. But this flight is different. It wasn't because of the weather. It wasn't because of technical issues. It was because a passenger didn't react as he expected. Whitaker glanced through the internal report on the screen. No warnings, no special notes. Everything was normal. That's what annoyed him. The first officer sat beside him silent. He sensed a subtle tension in the air. No one spoke, but it was there. Whitaker broke the silence. "Did you see that passenger?" he asked, his tone sounding like he was making small talk. The first officer was slightly surprised. "Which passenger?" "Captain." "The woman from earlier," Whitaker said. "Miss Brooks." First officer nodded slowly. "I saw it." "She didn't react," Whitaker continued. "No arguing. No making a fuss." First officer pondered. "Perhaps she just wants peace and quiet," Whitaker smirked. "Or she's preparing to do something." The phrase hung, suspended in the cockpit. First officer turned around. "Captain, she hasn't done anything wrong." Whitaker turned to look at him. His gaze was sharper. You've never seen people like that. People like that? First officer asked again very softly. Whitaker didn't answer. He turned back to the screen, but in his mind a thought formed that silence wasn't safe. In the back cabin, Evelyn Brooks was sitting and reading a few pages, not to kill time, but to keep her breathing steady. She could feel the change in the flight's atmosphere very clearly, not from the turbulence, but from the attitude. Jason Reed walked past again. This time he stopped. Ma'am, his voice was slightly different, harder. Captain wants to know if you're cooperating well. Evelyn looked up. Cooperation on what Jason avoided her gaze. About following the crew's instructions, Evelyn looked straight at him. I complied. Jason pursed his lips. Captain just wanted to make sure. Guarantee, what Evelyn asked, her voice still calm. Jason didn't answer. He just said, if there's a problem, we'll have to handle it according to procedure. Evelyn nodded. I understand the procedure. Jason turned away faster than usual. Ahead, Lena Morales saw the exchange from a distance. She felt her stomach tighten. She recognized that tone, the tone of something shifting from service to control. Lena walked quickly towards the galley and pressed the intercom button. Captain, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. Passenger Brooks isn't causing any trouble. She's very quiet. A brief silence on the other end of the line. Lena Whitaker replied, his voice cold. You did your part well. I'll take care of the rest. The words weren't spoken loudly, but they were enough for Lena to understand that a boundary had just been drawn. She put the receiver down. Her hands trembled slightly. In the cockpit, Whitaker opened the intercom system with the ground. A short message appeared on the ACARS screen. NS 417. Request note on passenger Brooks Evelyn. Potential non-compliance earlier. Please advise security readiness upon arrival. First officer turned to look at him, his eyes wide. Captain, was that really necessary? Whitaker didn't look at him. Precautions. But she did nothing, first officer said, his voice low but clear. Whitaker turned. His eyes were cold. You're young. You don't understand. The biggest problems always start with seemingly insignificant things. First officer remained silent, but inwardly, a very clear feeling was forming. This was no longer just a precaution. In the back compartment, Evelyn Brooks felt her phone vibrate slightly in her pocket. A very faint vibration, but she noticed it immediately. She took out her phone. A new message from Daniel Price. There's an update from the airline. They just added a security flag with her name on it. Evelyn stared at the words for a long time. This is the moment. The moment when things can take two very different paths. She could stop right now. One text message, one phone call, one name said, and it would all be over. Or she could let it go. To see how far this system is willing to go, thinking no one is watching. Evelyn typed her reply slowly and steadily. I know. Just let them do it. 3 dots appeared. Then Daniel replied. Are you sure? They're preparing to call security upon landing? Evelyn looked around the compartment. Ordinary people. No one knew what was being written somewhere ahead. I'm sure she typed. Write it all down. She turned off the screen. She put the phone down. In first class, Margaret Collins took off her headphones and turned to Lena. What's all the noise about in the back compartment? She asked. Lena hesitated. Nothing serious, ma'am. Margaret tilted her head. I don't want to go to New York with any trouble. Lena nodded. But deep down, a question echoed clearly. Who was the real problem? The plane continued its flight. Outside, the sky was calm. Everything looked perfectly normal. But internally, an invisible line has been crossed. Captain Thomas Whitaker believed he was protecting the flight. Jason Reed believed he was simply following orders. Margaret Collins believed order had been maintained. Only Evelyn Brooks knew that from the moment the security flag was raised, this story was no longer about a seat. It became a test, not for her, but for all those who believe that power gives them the right to decide who the problem is. And Flight NS 417, still quietly heading towards New York, carried with it a mistake that no one in the cockpit realized was irreversible. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside the window, the dark sky turned a deep blue, then a deep black. The stars twinkled like distant dots of light serene amidst the turmoil of human activity. Evelyn Brooks gazed out the window, not trying to find a specific star. She simply let her eyes drift into the distance. Her breathing was even. Her shoulders relaxed. There was no sign of anxiety, but in her mind, every detail was lining up. She knew she was being flagged. She knew ground security had been notified, and she knew that from this moment on, everything would be recorded, not just in memory, but in records. She wasn't afraid. Fear often arises when people don't know what lies ahead. But Evelyn knew very well. In first class, Margaret Collins adjusted her posture. She glanced at her watch, then at the flight information display screen. "We're almost there," she said to the man sitting next to her. Finally, he replied, his voice relieved. Margaret smiled. "I hate flights that have problems." "There's nothing special about this trip," he said. Margaret shrugged slightly. "Just some unnecessary things." She didn't realize that in using the word unnecessary, she was inadvertently describing precisely what was about to happen to the order she believed in. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Whitaker checks the landing schedule. Favorable wind, clear runway, everything is up to standard. He felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Despite the initial inconvenience, the flight would end on time. He would complete his mission, and what happened afterward, he believed, would be handled. First officer looked out the cockpit window and saw the lights of New York City gradually appearing in the distance. He swallowed hard. "Captain," he said, his voice slow. "Regarding passenger Brooks, was security necessary?" Whitaker didn't turn around. "We've already discussed this. But if there's no basis," Whitaker interrupted. "The basis is that I deem it necessary." A long silence ensued. First officer said nothing more, but a chill ran down his spine. Not because of the danger of flying, but because of the rigidity of human nature. In the back compartment, Lena Morales walked down the aisle, giving a final check of her seatbelt. When she reached Evelyn's seat, she stopped. "We're about to land," Lena said softly. "Is everything all right?" Evelyn looked up. She met Lena's gaze. "You've done your part." Lena paused. "Aye," Evelyn smiled faintly. "Whatever the outcome, you tried your best." Lena swallowed hard. She nodded, then walked away. Her heart was pounding. She didn't understand why, but there was something about the way Evelyn spoke that made her feel both comforted and anxious. The seatbelt sign lit up. The loudspeaker blared. Captain Whitaker's voice, familiar, deep, and firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent to prepare for landing in New York. The weather is favorable. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." For many, that voice was a symbol of safety. But for Evelyn, it was a reminder that some voices are automatically considered trustworthy simply because of where the speaker is sitting. The plane vibrated slightly as it descended. The city lights grew brighter, stretching into long streaks like the blood vessels of a giant body. Evelyn placed her hands on the armrests, not squeezed, just resting them. The phone in her pocket vibrated gently again. She didn't take it out immediately. She waited for the second vibration, then the third. Finally, she opened her pocket. Message from Daniel Price. "They've deployed security to the gate." Not just any gate. Evelyn read every word carefully. Then she typed her reply. "Which gate? Secondary hangar. Private area." Evelyn closed her eyes for a very brief second. Not out of surprise, but out of confirmation. "Write it down," she texted. "And keep everything in order." Daniel replied immediately. "Understood." Evelyn turned off the screen. She put the phone down. Her heartbeat remained steady. But in her heart, a milestone had just been reached. In first class, Margaret Collins took off her headphones. She leaned over towards Lena. "I've noticed we don't usually go through the gate," she said, her voice slightly raised. Lena looked out the window. She saw the plane taxiing in a different direction. There was no familiar jet bridge, just a wide, empty area illuminated by tall lampposts. "Perhaps it was a special arrangement," Lena said, unsure. Margaret frowned, especially for whom Lena didn't answer. From the cockpit, Whitaker looked out. He saw the hangar come into view. He smirked. "Security is ready," he said, as if talking to himself. The first officer watched. He saw black cars parked there. No company logos. No regular passenger vehicles. "Captain," he whispered. Whitaker did not respond. The plane touched down. The landing was a little rough, not dangerous, but enough to startle a few passengers. A sigh spread through the cabin. Evelyn felt the jolt, then the deceleration. She sat still, not gripping the handrail, not looking around. When the plane came to a complete stop, the seatbelt sign remained illuminated. There was no applause, no familiar commotion. The atmosphere was unusual. The loudspeaker blared again. "Please remain seated," Whitaker said. "Security will be boarding to handle a situation." A wave of whispers spread. Everyone looked at each other. Their eyes turned toward the back of the compartment, as if someone had just been invisibly singled out. The man next to Evelyn turned to her. "Who are they talking about?" Evelyn looked straight ahead. "It's not clear yet." He swallowed hard. "It's not you, is it?" Evelyn turned her eyes calm. "If it were me, you'd know too." He remained silent. The airplane door opened. Not a jet bridge, but a movable staircase. A blast of cold air rushed in. The exterior lights shone directly into the cabin. Two people in security uniforms boarded. They weren't flight attendants. They weren't the familiar ground staff. Margaret Collins gripped the armrest of her chair. "What's going on?" she asked Lena, her voice betraying her irritation. Lena stood still. She didn't know how to answer. Evelyn Brooks sat there, not moving, not bowing her head, not standing up. She knew that at this moment her silence was no longer passive. It's an invitation for the system to come out into the open. And as security footsteps echoed down the aisle, flight NS 417 officially took a different trajectory. There is no turning back. Footsteps echoed in the narrow aisle of the airplane cabin. Not hurried, not frantic, but clear enough for all eyes to turn in the same direction. Two security guards stepped forward, dark uniforms, straight posture, expressionless faces. They didn't look around searching. They walked with a very clear purpose. The passenger compartment fell into a tense silence. Evelyn Brooks remained seated in the back row, her back straight. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests. Her gaze was calm, fixed straight ahead. She didn't stand up. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't make any movement that could be misinterpreted as protest. The man sitting next to her froze. He swallowed, his eyes flickering between fear and curiosity. "They're probably looking for someone," he whispered. Evelyn did not answer. Two security officers stopped at the back of the compartment. One glanced quickly over the rows of seats. The other looked down at a tablet computer. "Evelyn Brooks," the man asked, his voice neutral. A soft gasp was heard somewhere ahead. Margaret Collins turned, looking down the aisle, her gaze settling on Evelyn. She frowned. "That's impossible," she muttered. Evelyn slowly turned her head. She looked directly at the security officer. "Yes." The man beside her recoiled as if a distance of a few inches could protect him from something. "Please stand up," the security guard said. Evelyn nodded. She rose slowly, not in a hurry, without hesitation. She reached for her handbag and slung it over her shoulder. Lena Morales stood in the middle of the compartment, her hand unconsciously gripping her notebook. Her heart pounded. She watched Evelyn walk out into the aisle. No bowing, no trembling. There was only a terrifying calmness. What did she do wrong? Margaret Collins asked, her voice laced with undisguised annoyance. "What are you planning to do?" A security guard turned and said politely but firmly, "Ma'am, please remain seated." Margaret opened her mouth, intending to say more, but then stopped. There was something about that voice that she didn't recognize. It wasn't the voice of her servant. In the cockpit, Captain Thomas Whitaker rose from his seat. He adjusted his jacket, buttoning it up. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment the processing would be complete. "Keep the door open," he said to the first officer. "I'm going out." First officer looked at him, his eyes tense. "Captain, I think," Whitaker interrupted. "I already said it." He opened the cockpit door and stepped out. His eyes quickly scanned the passenger compartment, stopping at Evelyn standing in the aisle flanked by two security officers. A fleeting feeling of satisfaction washed over him. Not joy, rather the feeling of someone who believed they were right. "Finally, it's done," he muttered. Evelyn was led to the front. Each of her steps echoed softly on the floor, yet it seemed to register in the entire compartment. All eyes followed her. Some were curious. Some were annoyed. Some avoided looking. As we approached the airplane door, something unusual happened. Instead of leading Evelyn down the stairs, a security guard raised his hand to signal them to stop. "Please wait a moment," he said, his eyes looking outside. Whitaker stepped forward, his voice tinged with irritation. "What's the problem?" The security officer turned to him. "We're waiting for final instructions." Whitaker frowned. "The instructions are clear. This passenger is flagged. I am the flight captain." The security guard showed no sign of wavering. "Yes, sir. But there's an update." "What update?" Whitaker growled. A black car pulled up at the foot of the stairs. The door opened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, tall. His face was familiar to anyone who had ever attended a board meeting. Daniel Price. He ascended the airplane's stairs unhurried. Each step was steady. When he reached the door, he paused, looking around the cabin. His gaze swept over Margaret Collins, over Lena Morales, over the passengers who were holding their breath. Then he looked directly at Captain Whitaker. "Hello, Captain," Daniel said calmly. "I'm Daniel Price." Whitaker paused for a very brief moment. That name, he'd heard it somewhere, in internal newsletters. In high-level emails he often skimmed through. "Who are you?" Whitaker asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Daniel smiled slightly. "The acting COO of North Star Holdings." A wave of murmur spread through the compartment. Margaret Collins's eyes widened. "North Star Holdings," she whispered. The parent company. Daniel paid no attention. He turned to the security guard. "We can begin now." The security guard nodded. But instead of turning to Evelyn, he turned around and stood straight. "Captain Thomas Whitaker," he said clearly. "Please stay." Whitaker was stunned. What? Daniel stepped forward. "Captain, I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding." Whitaker chuckled dryly. "What are you talking about? She's the one who's been flagged." Daniel turned to look at Evelyn. "Miss Brooks, are you all right?" Evelyn nodded. "I'm fine." Daniel turned around. His gaze was colder. The person security was instructed to monitor. Wasn't Miss Brooks. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. "That's impossible," Whitaker said. "I've already submitted the request." "Yes," Daniel replied, "and we received it." He pulled a thin stack of papers from his briefcase. "Your request is unfounded. There was no disruptive behavior, no safety violations, but there's something else." Daniel stopped. He looked directly at Whitaker. "There are signs of abuse of power." A very faint "oh" sound was heard somewhere. Margaret Collins placed her hand on her chest. "What's going on?" Daniel turned to her, speaking politely. "Ma'am, please be seated." Whitaker took a step back. "You have no right," Daniel interrupted, his voice still calm. "We have." He gestured with his hand. The two security officers changed positions. They were no longer standing next to Evelyn. They stood on either side of Whitaker. Whitaker looked around. The eyes he had once known now seemed unfamiliar. There was no longer respect, only curiosity and suspicion. "What kind of game is this?" Whitaker growled. Daniel stared at him for a long time. "This is procedure, Captain. A procedure you take very seriously." Evelyn stood there, saying nothing. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence, along with Daniel's, was enough to turn things around. Lena Morales covered her mouth, her eyes wide. She felt her heart pounding, not from fear, but from a very strange feeling, as if the truth had just been revealed. Margaret Collins sat speechless. "So, who is she?" she whispered, looking at Evelyn. Daniel turned his head, smiling very slightly. "You'll know soon enough." Two security officers placed their hands on Whitaker's arms, not forcefully, but firmly. "Captain Thomas Whitaker," someone said. "Please come with us." Whitaker opened his mouth, but no words came out. Inside the plane, the silence broke into gasps of breath. Those who had once believed they knew who was in control now faced a different reality. The person they thought would be arrested wasn't the one being led away. And Evelyn Brooks, the woman who had been relegated to the back seat, stood there, calm, without winning or losing, just waiting for the next moment where all the questions would be answered. The New York night wind blew stronger in the hangar area. Cold air rushed into the cabin, carrying the smell of metal and damp asphalt. High-powered lights shone down, creating harsh patches of light on the ground where everything had just become too real. Captain Thomas Whitaker stood in the aisle, two security officers on either side. He wasn't handcuffed. Not yet. But his shoulders were no longer as straight as when he'd stepped out of the cockpit. His back was slightly hunched, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on each vertebra. "You can't do this," Whitaker said, his voice hoarse. "I'm the captain of this flight." Daniel Price stood opposite him, holding a thin file. "You were captain," Daniel said, his voice even. "But your authority ends when the plane comes to a stop." Whitaker shook his head. "I was just following procedure." "We feel the same way," Daniel replied. The rear passenger compartment was silent. No more murmuring, no more whispering. Everyone sensed that this was no longer a minor incident. This was a rare moment when power had been overturned, right before their eyes. Margaret Collins rose to her feet. "I want to know what's going on," she said, her voice high and sharp. "I'm a diamond client of North Star. I have the right." Daniel turned to her. His gaze was polite but unyielding. "Mrs. Collins, please sit down. All information will be provided when appropriate, suitable for whom Margaret snarled. With the truth, Daniel replied. She stood still. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her without trying to please her. At the far end of the compartment, Evelyn Brooks remained still. She neither moved forward nor backward. She let things unfold as they naturally would. Daniel turned to her. "Miss Brooks," he said. "We can get off the plane." Evelyn nodded. She stepped forward, walking past Whitaker. As they passed each other, Whitaker looked at her. His gaze was a mixture of bewilderment and anger. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Evelyn paused for a moment. She turned her head, looked straight at him. There was no challenge, no contempt. "I am a passenger," she said. "Until you decide, I am not." Whitaker opened his mouth but couldn't say anything. Evelyn continued walking. As they descended the stairs, the lights shone directly on them. The wind blew harder. On the runway, there wasn't just airport security. There were other faces, familiar suits, people. Whitaker had only ever seen in internal emails or company newsletters. "Counsel." Daniel stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He turned to Evelyn. "Do you want to say it yourself?" Evelyn looked around. Black cars, waiting eyes, people accustomed to deciding the fate of others in closed meeting rooms. "I'll tell you," she replied. Daniel took a step back. Evelyn Brooks stepped forward. No podium, no microphone, just her voice echoing in the vast expanse of the runway. "I'm Evelyn Brooks," she said slowly, "CEO of Aurora Capital Group." A wave of commotion spread. Margaret Collins put her hand to her mouth. Lena Morales stood still, her eyes wide. A few passengers whispered the company's name. Aurora Capital was not an unfamiliar name. It was the investment firm that had just completed the acquisition of a controlling stake in North Star Holdings. Daniel continued, his voice clear. "This morning, Aurora Capital completed the purchase of 52% of North Star Holdings voting shares." Whitaker felt his face flush. His ears were ringing. Numbers, percentages, financial terms he had previously ignored, now assaulted him like a collision. "What does that mean?" a passenger asked, his voice trembling. Daniel replied, "That means Miss Brooks is the controlling shareholder, the ultimate owner of this airline." Silent. It wasn't a silence born of shock. Rather, it was the silence of an old belief being pulled from its foundation. Margaret Collins took a step back. "Impossible," she whispered. She's sitting in the back seat." Evelyn turned to her. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a slight weariness. "The seat you sit in doesn't change who you are," Evelyn said. "It only reveals how others see you." Whitaker stood frozen. Cold sweat ran down his spine. "If only I had known," he began. Evelyn raised her hand, signaling them to stop. "If you had known," she said, her voice low but clear, "you would have treated me differently." The words weren't loud, but they cut deep, and that's the problem, she continued. "I don't want to be treated well because of who I am. I want to know how this system treats someone they think is nobody." Daniel opened the file. "Captain Whitaker, we have all the records," he said. "The security flag request was unfounded. The seat change was against policy, and internal emails show this wasn't the first time." Whitaker shook his head, his voice almost pleading. "I've been flying for 30 years. I have a family. Evelyn looked at him. There was no schadenfreude in her eyes, only a very quiet sadness. "I've also lost a lot to get to where I am," she said, "but I wouldn't use that to take away someone else's dignity." Daniel nodded to security. "Captain Thomas Whitaker, you are suspended immediately pending a formal investigation." Two security officers stepped forward. This time their hands rested more firmly on Whitaker's arm. Margaret Collins was horrified. "What about me?" she asked. "I did nothing wrong." Evelyn turned to her. "You didn't give the orders," she said, "but you benefited from that system." Margaret remained silent. Lena Morales stood there, tears silently welling up, not from fear, but because for the first time she saw someone in a position of power use it to express something she had always felt but never dared to name. Evelyn turned to Lena. "You tried," she said, "and it was worth it." Lena nodded, tears streaming down her face. Daniel closed the file. "We'll continue the rest in the meeting room." Evelyn looked back at the plane. The North Star had taken her on a flight unlike any she had ever taken before. She turned her back and walked away with Daniel towards the brighter lights. Behind them, Captain Whitaker was being led in the opposite direction. Two paths, One person once believed that power allowed them to judge. Another understands that power comes with responsibility. And on that icy runway, the truth was finally revealed. Without fanfare. Without fanfare. But it could not be retracted. The makeshift meeting room was located at the edge of the hangar, its white light shining directly onto a long, gray, laminate-covered table. There were no logos on the walls, no inspirational slogans. Only the heavy silence of a place used to handle matters that could not be postponed. Evelyn Brooks sat at the head of the table. She didn't take that seat because anyone invited her, rather because no one else would sit there. Daniel Price placed the file in front of her. Across the table, the 4 members of the North Star Holdings Board sat upright, their hands clasped together. No one spoke for the first few seconds. That silence wasn't due to a lack of information. Rather, it was because too much information had just been revealed. "We'll begin," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't high, nor low, just clear enough for everyone to hear. Daniel opened his tablet. First, he said Captain Thomas Whitaker is suspended immediately with no entitlements pending investigation. One of the council members cleared his throat. "We need to follow the personnel procedures." "Exactly," Evelyn replied. "And the process begins with admitting wrongdoing." No one objected. Daniel continued. "The request for security-related flagging is unfounded. This will be reported to the FAA and the Internal Legal Department." Another member frowned. "That will draw attention." "Attention is what we need," Evelyn said. "The key is to be discreet." Daniel nodded. "Secondly, all instances of unauthorized seat changes will be reviewed within 24 months. A soft sigh escaped from the far end of the table. Someone whispered, "There will be a lot of files." "Hopefully so," Evelyn replied. "Otherwise, that would be even more worrying." Outside the meeting room, Lena Morales leaned against the wall. Her hands were still trembling slightly. She hadn't been called in yet. But she knew what she was waiting for. She recalled the moment on the plane. She remembered Evelyn's eyes when she said, "You tried." The words weren't loud, but they've stayed with Lena ever since. Jason Reed stood at the other end of the hallway. He leaned against a pillar, his arms crossed over his chest. A light sweat beaded on the back of his neck. He didn't know what he was waiting for. He only knew that for the first time, just following orders was no longer a safe shield. In the meeting room, Daniel moved on to the next item. "Thirdly, we need a clear decision about our service culture." One council member leaned forward. "Are you referring to retraining?" Evelyn looked at him. "It's not just about training." She paused for a moment. "I'm talking about responsibility." She stood up, not to impress, but because she wanted to make a clear statement. "Tonight I didn't sit in the back seat because I wanted to try something new," Evelyn said. "I sat there because I was asked to, and within a few hours I've clearly seen the difference in how this system works." She looked at each person individually. No one shouted, no one fought. There was no scene of chaos. Only small needs were postponed. Averted gazes, cold words, and an unspoken belief that things could go a little slower in the background. No one interrupted. "That's how injustice exists," Evelyn continued. "Not through noise, but through familiarity." Daniel placed his hand on the table. "We propose creating a new position, Director of Passenger Experience." One council member nodded. "Who will take on the role?" Evelyn turned toward the door. "Please come in, Miss Morales." The door opened. Lena Morales walked in. She froze when she saw all eyes turned towards her. "Please sit down," Evelyn said. Lena sat down, her back straight, her hands resting on her thighs. She felt her heart pounding so hard that her ears were ringing. "Miss Morales," Evelyn said, her voice softer. "What did you do tonight when something went wrong?" Lena swallowed hard. I tried to report it, and I tried to make sure the passengers were safe." "Even though you know that might not be well received?" Evelyn asked. Lena nodded. "Yes." Evelyn turned to the council. "This is what I'm looking for," she said. "Not 30 years of experience. It's the ability to recognize when the system is going off track." A very faint murmur spread out. "Miss Morales," Daniel said, "we would like to offer you the interim position of Director of Passenger Experience." Lena's eyes widened. I'm just a flight attendant." "No," Evelyn said. "You understand passengers best." Lena bowed her head, tears falling. Not from joy, but because for the first time what she believed to be true was being called by name. In the hallway, Jason Reed was called into another small room. There was no boardroom. The lights were off. Just a human resources officer and an in-house lawyer. Mr. Reed, the HR representative, said, "We need to clarify some service behaviors." Jason sighed. "I was just following orders." The lawyer took notes. What instructions? Jason remained silent. In another corner of the hangar, Captain Thomas Whitaker sat alone on a metal chair. His coat was still neat, but his hands trembled slightly. No one called him captain anymore. A security officer approached. "You will be taken back to your hotel tonight. Your passport and temporary documents will be held." Whitaker nodded. "Can I call my wife?" "Yes," the other person replied. Whitaker held the phone, staring at the screen for a long time. Then he put it down. There were calls harder than any emergency call in the air. In the meeting room, Evelyn remained seated after everyone else had left. Daniel stood beside her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Evelyn sighed. "I'm fine." She looked out the window where the North Star was still parked silently. "But this is just the beginning." Daniel nodded. "The reaction won't be small." "I know," Evelyn replied. "But silence is the most precious thing." In a corner of the hallway, Margaret Collins was escorted to her private car. She said nothing. Her face was pale. For the first time, she was leaving a flight without feeling like the center of attention. Lena Morales stopped and watched. Then she looked at Evelyn. Their eyes met. No promises needed. No speeches required. There was only an unspoken understanding that from this moment on, something had changed. Not just for one flight, and it also allows a system to reflect on itself. The next morning, New York woke up as usual. The traffic is still heavy. The cafes are still open very early. People are still holding hot cups of coffee, their eyes glued to their phones, scrolling through the news almost unconsciously. That was until the name North Star Airways started appearing frequently on the screen. It started as just a short message. North Star's chief pilot has been suspended following a discrimination incident on an international flight. Then add another line. The CEO of Aurora Capital unexpectedly revealed himself to be a passenger who was forced to change seats, and then everything exploded. Within 3 hours, the story was no longer an internal incident. It became the subject of discussion on cable television, on morning radio, on social media, and in the boardrooms of corporations that had never imagined they were involved. At Aurora Capital Group headquarters, Evelyn Brooks stands in front of floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretches out below like a vast network of choices and consequences. Daniel Price walked in, a tablet in his hand. "The media is reacting strongly," he said. Evelyn didn't turn around. "Which way?" "Divided in two," Daniel replied. "One side praises, the other side defends." Evelyn nodded slightly. "That's normal." Daniel scrolled through the screen. "The hashtag Seat42 is trending." Evelyn smiled softly. "A number, but one that people will remember." In a television studio a few miles away, Margaret Collins sat across from the morning news anchor. The lights shone directly onto her face, revealing wrinkles that the makeup team had previously always carefully concealed. "Do you feel you've been treated unfairly?" the interviewer asked. Margaret took a deep breath. "I think things have been blown out of proportion. But do you agree that if that passenger hadn't been the CEO, the story would have ended very differently?" the host continued. Margaret was silent for a few seconds. The camera didn't cut that moment. The silence was broadcast live. I don't know," she said finally. That answer was quoted hundreds of times a day. Elsewhere, Lena Morales sat in a small conference room at North Star Airways headquarters. Before her was a group of middle managers, many of whom had worked there for years longer than she had. "We're not talking about individual mistakes," Lena said, her voice slightly shaky but clear. "We're talking about process." A man folded his arms. "You're new to this position." Lena nodded. "Yes, and perhaps that's why I see things that people are so used to that they no longer notice." No one responded immediately. She projected a simple diagram onto the screen. "Why does feedback from the rear compartment always take longer to process? Why are decisions from the cockpit rarely questioned?" Another person sighed. "Because that's how things always work." Lena looked them straight in the eye. And that night, that very way it always works, sent the whole company reeling. At Newark Airport in the staff parking area, Captain Thomas Whitaker sat in his gray rental car. He hadn't gone to the hotel. He hadn't gone home. He sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, staring at the dashboard. The radio was playing a news program. The incident raises larger questions about power and responsibility within the aviation industry. Whitaker turned the volume down. He recalled the moment he said I was just following procedure. For the first time in my life, that phrase no longer brought a sense of security. At a university not far away in a business administration class, the professor paused in the middle of his lecture. He projected a newspaper headline onto the screen. "We're going to talk about this," he said. "Not because it's sensational, but because it's very familiar," the students murmured. One raised their hand. "Sir, if she's the CEO, why didn't she say so right away?" The professor smiled. "That's the most important question." Meanwhile, at Aurora Capital, Evelyn Brooks sat in a private conference room. Before her was a group of senior executives from the subsidiary companies. "We're not going to release a celebratory statement," Evelyn said. "We're not going to use this story to boost our image." One person in the group asked, "So what do we say to the press?" "The truth," Evelyn replied. "And that's all." Daniel nodded. "We've prepared a short statement." Evelyn read through it. Then she corrected one sentence. "Instead of 'we do not tolerate discrimination,' write 'we take responsibility when discrimination occurs.'" Daniel looked at her. "That would put more pressure on me." "That's right," Evelyn said. "And that's the price of trust." In a small cafe, Lena Morales sat alone after work. She scrolled through her phone and saw a candid photo of herself taken during this morning's meeting. The comments were varied: praise, suspicion, even mockery. She put the phone down. She exhaled. She recalled the moment she stood on the plane when everything was still uncertain, when she didn't know which way she was on. Now she knows. In the hallway of another building, Jason Reed emerged from the Human Resources office. In his hand was a thin stack of papers. He hadn't been fired, but he had been suspended for mandatory retraining. He looked at the paper. Then he looked around. No one was paying attention to him. No one was filming. No one was interviewing him. This silence to him weighed more heavily than any criticism. That evening, Evelyn Brooks returned to her apartment. No party, no press conference, just a simple dinner. She stood before the mirror, taking off her office coat. Looking in the mirror, she saw a tired woman, but her gaze remained steady. The phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. "I've sat in seat 42B many times. Thank you for not taking it lightly." Evelyn read it. Then she put the phone down. She understood that from now on, this story no longer belonged to her. It belongs to those who were once silent, those who once thought that feeling disregarded was normal, and also to those who once believed that power allowed them not to listen. Aftershocks have begun. It wasn't a loud explosion. Instead, it spread slowly through conversations, meeting rooms, and airplane cabins, and nobody knows where it will stop. 3 weeks after the NS-417 incident, there are no longer reporters standing outside North Star Airways headquarters. No more mobile television vans parked on the roadside. The hashtag that once topped the trending charts has sunk deep, replaced by new stories and new social outrage. The surface is still, but inside things are shifting. At North Star's training center in Denver, a new training session begins at 7 o'clock in the morning. No banners, no opening speeches. Just a large room, white lights, chairs arranged in an arc. Lena Morales is standing at the front. She wasn't wearing a flight attendant uniform, nor was she wearing a powerful suit. Just a simple shirt holding a thin stack of papers in her hand. "We don't start with rules," Lena said. "We start with a question." She looked around the room where the pilot, flight attendants, cabin supervisor, and even a few ground staff members were seated. When a passenger presses the call button and no one answers what is actually happening, one person shrugged. Maybe they're busy. Maybe Lena nodded. Or maybe we've gotten used to not answering. No one laughed. No one objected. Lena continued. "That night I was standing less than 10 steps from seat 42B. I heard it. I saw it. And it took me a few seconds to decide whether I should go over or not." She paused. Those few seconds, that's where culture truly exists. In the back seat, a young pilot bowed his head. He recalled times he had turned away simply because it was not his business. At that same time, in a small office in New Jersey, Captain Thomas Whitaker sat at his kitchen counter. On the table was a stack of papers, a suspension notice, a request to participate in a psychological evaluation, and a temporary work schedule as a simulation trainer if approved. He held the piece of paper for a long time. Then he put it down. The house was quiet. No more the sound of rolling suitcases. No more uniforms hanging ready every morning. His wife hadn't spoken much since that day. No reproach. No comfort. just a silent distance harder to name than anger. Whitaker looked out the window. A plane flew across the gray sky. The familiar sound of the engine now sounded strange. For the first time in years, he asked himself, it wasn't that I had done anything wrong. It was that I hadn't seen something. At Aurora Capital Group, Evelyn Brooks walked into an internal meeting. No press, no live stream, just the familiar faces of the leadership team. "What have we achieved?" someone asked. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She looked at the data on the screen. North Star's stock had stabilized. Some partners had withdrawn. Some new ones had emerged. "We haven't achieved anything yet," Evelyn said. "We've only stopped to look." Daniel Price nodded. "The pressure from other companies is increasing. Several CEOs have called privately asking if we've gone too far." Evelyn smiled softly. "They don't ask out of concern. They ask out of fear." "So what's your response?" Daniel asked. Evelyn looked up. "I said that the scariest thing isn't being called by name. It's when no one has the courage to call your name anymore." At another airport, an elderly flight attendant stood before a visibly upset passenger. The man complained about his seat, the wait time, and all sorts of minor things. The flight attendant took a deep breath. Then, very calmly, she said, "Sir, I'm listening, and I will handle it. But I need you to speak to me, not with anger." The man paused. His anger was not reflected. It subsided. One small change. No one is filming. In another class, Lena Morales sat at the back of the room listening as a young flight attendant recounted an awkward situation. "I used to think that if I didn't speak up, everything would just blow over," the girl said. "But now I see. It didn't blow over. It lingered." Lena smiled. "And each time it accumulates, it makes the system heavier." At a roadside diner, Jason Reed sat alone. He was in retraining. No flying. No serving. Just studying. He flipped through his notes from this morning's training session. One line was underlined, "Doing nothing is also an option." Jason recalled the moment on the flight. He remembered how he avoided eye contact with the passenger in the back seat. At the time, he thought he was avoiding trouble. Now he understands he's chosen trouble for someone else. That evening, Evelyn Brooks drove alone to the suburbs. No driver, no assistant. She parked in a small parking lot near the airport. She sat still, watching the planes take off. The lights flickered. The runway was long and straight. The phone vibrated. A message from Lena. Today, a flight attendant stood up to defend a passenger despite the backlash. "I think that started with your story." Evelyn read it. Then she typed a reply. "No." It started with her choosing not to turn away. She put the phone down. She took a deep breath. She recalled her childhood, the bus rides, the times she was stared at, the moments she learned to be silent in order to survive. She doesn't hate silence. She just hates it being used to conceal things. In a flight simulator room, Whitaker sat in front of the control panel, not as captain, just a retrainee. The coach asked, "In a conflict situation, what is your priority?" Whitaker was silent. Then he said slowly, "It's not about control. It's about understanding." The coach looked at him slightly surprised. Then he nodded. Outside, it started to rain. The raindrops were small, steady, and quiet. In many places, no one was talking about seat 42B anymore. But somewhere, a flight attendant paused a little longer when the call bell rang. A pilot asked for clarification before giving orders. A passenger felt noticed. There is no newspaper headline. There was no big announcement. It's just the small things that are changing how people treat each other little by little. And sometimes it's those changes that go unnoticed that last the longest. 6 months later, Seattle Airport on an early autumn morning. The sky was clear, the breeze gentle. Yellow leaves were beginning to appear sporadically along the walkways leading to the terminal. The air carried the familiar scent of hot coffee and the metallic smell of the endless stream of flights. Flight NS-228 is preparing to depart for San Francisco. Evelyn Brooks entered the train station alone. No assistants, no media team. No one recognized her immediately. She wore a simple gray sweater, dark trousers, and flat shoes. Over her shoulder was an old, unmarked leather bag that attracted no attention. At first glance, she looked like one of hundreds of other passengers preparing for a short workday flight. She stopped in front of the electronic display board. She looked for the flight number. NS-228. On time. She smiled very gently. At the boarding counter, a young flight attendant scanned tickets. The girl looked up and saw Evelyn. "Good morning, ma'am." The voice was natural, not artificial, not overly enthusiastic, just respectful enough. Evelyn nodded. "Hello. Have a pleasant flight, ma'am," the flight attendant added. No one looked closely at the ticket. No one looked at the clothes. No one judged where Evelyn belonged. Evelyn entered the airplane cabin. Narrow aisle. Soft lighting. The familiar smell of a domestic flight. Quiet conversations. The sound of luggage being loaded into the overhead compartments. She walked straight to the back. Seats 40, 41. Then it stopped at 42B. She stood still for a moment. Just a very short moment. No painful memories resurfaced. No anger. Just a very clear realization. She sat down. Middle seat. Not wide. Not comfortable. But clean. Tidy. Screen works well. Headphones are neatly placed in the seat pocket. The woman sitting next to her was middle-aged. She gave a polite smile. "Hello," she said. "Hello, ma'am," Evelyn replied. No one asked Evelyn what she did for a living. No one was curious why she chose this seat, and that's what made Evelyn feel calm. Lena Morales entered the compartment at the front. Now she's no longer a young flight attendant. Her name tag displays a new title, but her uniform remains simple, not much different from before. Lena began inspecting the compartments. As she reached row 42, her eyes glanced at Evelyn. The two recognized each other. There were no hugs, no special greetings, just a brief glance, a very slight nod. As the two of them understood, we don't need to say anything more. The plane began to taxi. The engine noise gradually increased. A gentle pressure pushed the person sitting in the seat back into place. Through the small window, the runway stretched on. The city receded behind. Evelyn closed her eyes the moment the plane lifted off the ground. Not for prayer, just for feeling. In another row, Jason Reed sat in the seat of the flight attendant in charge of the rear cabin. He was impeccably dressed in his uniform. His movements were slower than before. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't avoid the passenger's gaze. When he reached row 42, he stopped. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you like some water or coffee?" he asked the woman next to Evelyn. "Coffee, please," she replied. Jason turned to Evelyn. "And what about you?" Evelyn looked up. "Water, thank you." Jason nodded. Yes. There were no scrutinizing glances, no awkward silences. It was just a normal exchange. In the truest sense of the word, in the cockpit, a newly appointed captain was inspecting the control panel. He was young, but his voice over the loudspeaker was clear and calm. "Welcome aboard, Flight NS 228. We are delighted to serve you today." No one emphasized any particular compartment. No one implied who was more important. The aircraft maintained its altitude. Evelyn opened her eyes. She looked around. A young man is reading work documents. A female student is wearing headphones. An elderly couple is holding hands. Nobody knows who she is, and this time she didn't need to prove anything. Evelyn recalled a question once asked in a class. Why didn't she say she was the CEO from the start? Now she has a clear answer. Because if she had to speak, the issue wasn't about the seating arrangement. It lies in how people treat each other when they think no one is watching. The flight attendant walked past. Jason placed the glass of water in front of Evelyn. "Please feel free to call if you need anything else." Evelyn smiled. "Thank you." She took a small sip. The water was cool, ordinary, nothing special. But that moment for her was truly perfect. Elsewhere, Captain Thomas Whitaker was sitting in a training waiting room. He wasn't flying this flight. He probably wouldn't be flying for a long time. On the table was an old notebook. He opened it and wrote a line. "Power doesn't give you the right to judge. It gives you the responsibility to look more closely." He closed the notebook. "Out there, another plane is taking off. Return to compartment 42. The woman next to Evelyn leaned over. "Do you fly a lot?" Evelyn thought for a moment. "Quite a lot." "Do you prefer to sit in the middle?" she added, smiling slightly. Evelyn looked down at the chair she was sitting in. Then she looked out the window. "There are times," she said slowly, "when I like to recall the feeling of places that people often overlook." The woman nodded. "I understand. That answer needs no further explanation." The plane began to descend. The city of San Francisco unfolded below. The blue sea, the long bridge, the winding streets. The seatbelt warning light is on. Lena Morales walked along the aisle. When she reached row 42, she paused for a moment. "The flight is about to land," she said, her voice warm. "Is everything all right?" Evelyn looked up. "It's fine." Lena smiled. Not the smile of a subordinate to her CEO, but the smile of one human being to another. The plane touched down, smoothly. No one applauded, but no one was tense. When the plane came to a complete stop, passengers stood up one by one and retrieved their luggage. No one pushed or shoved. No one gave orders. Evelyn was the last to stand up. She grabbed her bag and walked out into the hallway. Before leaving the compartment, she turned back to look at seat 42B one last time. The chair was empty, normal, no markings whatsoever. But for her, it was no longer a symbol of contempt. It's a reminder. That character isn't determined by the seat one sits in. That value doesn't come from position, and that the world will only truly change when people choose to see each other as human beings. Evelyn stepped off the plane, blend in with the crowd. No one looked back. And this time, it means everything is going in the right direction. This story isn't really about a flight. It's about how people treat each other when they think no one's watching. We'll understand once we've lived long enough. Injustice rarely appears loudly. It comes subtly, very familiarly, in a fleeting glance, in an impatient word, in someone being left behind, simply because of a small matter. Evelyn Brooks didn't win because she was CEO. She won because she didn't let power cloud her compassion. She understood that if people only respect you because they know who you are, that's not true respect. The biggest lesson here isn't about karma or revenge. It's about personal responsibility. The responsibility of those in power is to look down. The responsibility of those in the middle is not to turn away. And the responsibility of each of us is to treat others with kindness even when it doesn't benefit us personally. You may not own an airline, but every day you own how you speak, how you listen, and how you choose to side with people or remain indifferent. And sometimes just one small action is enough to change an entire journey. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until the end. If it made you think, reminisce, or feel comforted in any way, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because each share you make could be the 42B seat someone needs to see. See you again in the next stories.